Now let's create a register and login form where the user can register and log in. We can register by entering an email, for example, like npc@gmail.com. We need a username as well and a password. Once we press register, we create an account and log in at the same time. So we're getting redirected to the home page. If we take a look at the database, we have this database right here. If I'm going to reload, we have a new user right here with an email, a username, and a password. The password is going to be hashed right here. So this is also secure and best practice. And now we can also press the logout button to log out. And now we can use the created user to log in as well. So we can, for example, use npc@gmail.com. We need to enter the password. And if the credentials are correct, then we're logging in. If the credentials are wrong though, you can see that we're getting an error message right here. So let's try that one with the correct credentials once again. So we're pressing login, and as you can see, we're getting redirected to the home page. So we can log out afterwards again. This is not the most beautiful form, but this will definitely show you everything you need to create a full register, login, and logout form. And afterwards, you will definitely be able to create a login, logout, and register form similar to Instagram, for example, because this includes all of the PHP functionality that you will need. So let's get started, guys. To get started, we first need to create our project. So we're going to open our file explorer. We're going to navigate to this PC, local disk, into the XAMPP folder, wherever you have that one stored. Most of the times you will store that one on your local disk. And then we open htdocs so we can create a project inside of this folder. Again, you always need to create a project inside of htdocs. So we're going to create a new folder. That one has the name, in our case, practice 3, for example. Let's go into the folder, open terminal, and let's just open this folder within Visual Studio Code by using code followed by a dot. Let's execute. And now we have this folder opened within Visual Studio Code. Now we also need to open XAMPP because we want to start our live server as well as our Apache server. So just press start and start right here, and this starts the Apache server. The Apache server, again, is important to start our website on localhost / followed by the folder name. In our case, the folder name is practice_3. So I'm going to enter that one here. Since we do not have an index.php right now, we're not seeing anything. So let's create that index.php file. And now let's create a basic HTML template. And right here, let's just output some random text for now. Let's reload the page. And now we should see this random text right here. We also started the MySQL server, as you can see. So let's take a look at that one. We can access our MySQL server by saying localhost /php myadmin. So we're seeing this dashboard right now. And in order to create users, we first need to create a database, and we need to create a table that stores the user data in the end. Let's go to the SQL tab. Let's say create database followed by the database name. In our case, users_db. Let's execute that statement. We now created our users_db, but this users_db does not have a table yet where we can store our user data. To change that, we say create table followed by the table name. Table name users might make sense, but this is up to you again. And this users table now needs to have some columns. So we can define some columns within those brackets. The first column should always be the ID to uniquely identify each single user. The type is usually an integer, unsigned, so it can only be positive. Auto increment, so the database automatically increments the ID for every new user. And this ID is the primary key. For the username, it might make sense to at least store the email, the username, and the password. And maybe also a created at timestamp. So let's say our first field is email, varchar 255. The email cannot be null, and the email has to be unique, because if you think about an app like Instagram, if you log in with their email, it might not make too much sense to have two users with the same email, because when logging in, it's not really easy to uniquely identify each individual user if there exist two or more users with the same email. So either the email or the username should always be unique, so you can make sure that when the user logs in, you can uniquely identify the user just by using email or username. We're going to use a username as well. That one can have a varchar of 60, and I think that is more than enough for a normal username. That one cannot be null as well, but that one does not need to be unique because our email is already unique. And for the PVD, so password, we're going to accept varchar of 60 characters, and this one cannot be null again. Why do we accept 60 characters? Because the hashing algorithm that we're going to use later on to hash our password is always going to create a hash that has the length of exactly 60 characters. So even if the user enters a pretty short password like so, this will turn out to be a hash of 60 characters anyways. And the same goes for a super long password. So storing exactly 60 characters is enough. Let's also create a created@. field. So we are storing the time of creation. The data type is going to be timestamp. This cannot be null. And the default value is going to be current timestamp, for example, like so. And obviously not null is not that important because we will by default create a timestamp within our database anyways. Let's just go. And we did not select the database yet. So we need to say that we want to create that table within our users_db. We can do that by saying use users_db. Let's press go. And as you can see, we inserted our users table into the users_db database. And this users table now has the columns ID, email, username, PVD, and created@. But we do not have any users at the moment. So let's change that by first giving the user the option to enter some input. And in this case, I really want to show you how this works in a real world scenario. So we're also going to create proper styling, or at least somewhat proper styling, and a proper login form. I'm going to go into our index.php. Right here, we will create a form of type post. We will define the action later on. We have an input of type email because we need to accept an email. The name is going to be email. ID is going to be email. Placeholder is also going to be email, for example. Let's create a second input for our username of type text. Name is going to be username. ID is going to be username. Placeholder is going to be username. And a third input to accept our password input. So an input of type password. Name is going to be password. ID is going to be password. And the placeholder is going to be password. And let's also add a button of type submit to submit this form that says, for example, register. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, this is a normal register form, but that one looks pretty terrible at this point. In order to change that, we can include a style sheet by using link:/CSS. And let's just create a style.css file for this project. I'm going to use the universal selector, margin 0, padding 0, box sizing, border box. And I'm just going to make this pretty quick because this is not a CSS tutorial, but rather a PHP tutorial. So we removed all of the basic styles. Now inside of the form, I will say that I want to have a display of flex, a flex direction of column. The form should have a width of 100%, but the max width should be equal to 400 pixels. Let me target form input. Our input fields will have a width of 100%, so they will take up all of the available space of this form. Let me reload. So we have this effect right here. As you can see, this is what it looks like if we are going to resize this. Let me also target the entire body. For the entire body, I'm going to say display is going to be equal to flex, justify content, center, align items, center. So this entire body is now a flex box. I'm also going to say 300 pixels. Let me save that one. And as you can see, we're getting this effect. Looks a little bit better in my opinion. And maybe 200 is actually even better in this case. So we can see it on the small screen. For the entire body height, I also want to say min height is going to be equal to 100 viewport height. So now this is centered. For the form, we have a display of flex. So let's also use a gap of maybe 10 pixels between our individual input items. Let's use 7. For the input field, I say that I want to have a padding, top, bottom, left, right, 10 pixels, border, radius, 5 pixels, outline should be none. Let me refresh. So now this is what this looks like. Border, 1 pixel, solid, RGBA, 0, 0, 0, 0.4, like so. Let me reload. Now this is what this looks like. Form, button, so I'm going to target the button, padding of 10 pixels, background. Let me just use RGBA, 0, 0, 0, and 1, for example, and I'm going to pick some form of blue, so a similar blue to Facebook, for example, like so. Color is going to be white, so the text color will be white of our button. This is what the button looks like now. Border is going to be 0, border radius 5 pixels, for example. And this is a basic input field. And we can also say cursor is going to be equal to a pointer. Let me save that one. Let's also add an H2 right above. So we can just say h2, or let's say h1, doesn't really matter, register, like so. So we have this effect. And right below, let's just add a div that says already have an account, question mark. Let's put that one within a paragraph, like so. And right next to that one, we will have an anchor tag that redirects us to a different page. And that one is going to be our login.php page. And the text is going to be login. Let's give this entire div a class of change, for example. Let's reload the page again. And now let's fix the styling. For our form, we are going to say text align of center. So the text is centered right here. For our change container, I'm going to say display flex gap 2 pixels. Now we have this effect right here. And for the width, I'm maybe going to say 230, like so. Dot change will have a font size of 0.9 rem and justify content of center. For the entire body, I want to have a different font family. So I'm going to say font family, system UI. And let me also target the anchor tag by saying text decoration is none, font weight is going to be bold, and the color is going to be black. So now we have this effect right here. And this one is not perfectly looking, but this will definitely do the job. So now I already defined that we will redirect the user to our login.php once we click on this anchor tag. So let's create that page by saying this one is the login.php page. We're going to create a basic template. And for the basic template, we can also just insert this form right here because the form will look pretty much the same. The only difference is that this one is going to be login. This one will say don't have an account, for example, so register, and we will not need our username field for our login. So let's save that one. Let's press login. And as you can see, we're getting this result right here. And I'm also going to link our style.css file because the styles should be the exact same ones. And now, as you can see, this here's the login page. And this should be the register page, but at the moment we are again going to redirect to the login.php, but we need to redirect to the index.php if we are on our login.php page. So register, login, register, login. So this seems to work. Now let's get to the PHP code. And if you work with a real project, you usually create all of your PHP files that work with the database inside of an includes folder. So include, and inside of this folder, I'm going to create a dbh for database handler.inc.php. And this is just a convention. Obviously, you can use whatever name you like. Right here, I don't need any form of HTML, so I just need PHP code. And if you only need PHP code, you will not need this closing tag at the end. And you can just open this PHP tag. By doing so, you say right here, PHP code is going to start, and it will never end. So this entire file will be PHP code. To create a connection to our database, we first need to create a DSN, so a data source name that is going to be equal to MySQL host. The host is equal to localhost because we're executing this on our local host at the moment. We also need to define a DB name that is going to be equal to the database name that we defined previously. In our case, the name of our database is users_db. So users_db. And we can define the char set for our last argument, and that one is equal to UTF-8 MB4. Let's save that one. Let's also create a DB username that is going to be equal to root, and the DB password is going to be equal to an empty string in our case. Again, if you don't know what your database username and database password is, go to PHP myadmin, user accounts, and right here you can see I have a user that has the username root and a password no. So no password at all, so an empty string. And for most of you, this should be the exact same. Let's go to our page again, and let's create our PO connection within a try catch block. So try catch. We're going to get a PDO exception object in case we get an exception. And if we get an exception, we can just use error log error colon, and let's concatenate that error log with our get message. So we're logging the message, the error message, in case we are getting an error. And otherwise, we're just going to create our PDO object that is equal to our new PDO constructor. The constructor, again, accepts a couple of arguments like DSN, DB username, and DB password, like so. And now you can see as the fourth argument, we can also pass in some options. And I did not talk about those options up to that point. And it is essentially just an associative array that defines how your PDO connection should behave. So those are just default settings that you can set for your PDO connection. And I think it's easier if I just show you. So let's create this options associative array like so. We're going to define PDO : attribute error mode. And as you can see, there exist a lot of attributes: attribute autocommit, attribute case, cursor name, and so on. So you can define a lot of different settings for your PDO connection. But the most important ones are attribute _ error mode. And this one is usually equal to PDO error mode exception. I'll explain those ones in a second after I've shown you all of the important ones. The second one is PDO : attribute _ default fetch mode. That one is equal to PDO fetch associative. And the last one that you always want to set is going to be equal to PDO : attribute emulate prepared. And this one should be equal to false. So those ones are really, really important. So those are the options you always want to set. And as you can see, instead of this associative array, every single option, so every single key starts with an attribute, so underline, followed by whatever you want to define. PDO : attribute error mode equal to PDO error mode exception says that the error mode of your PHP code, so for this entire PDO connection, is going to be the error mode of exception. By default, if you get an error within PHP, PHP will only throw a warning and your code will keep executing. And obviously, if you really get an error, this is nothing that you really want to do. You always want to throw an error and stop the code from executing. So this here is super, super important. Always make sure to add this line right here. That makes sure that errors will be handled properly. The second one, PDO attribute default fetch mode, just says that we are by default going to fetch data as an associative array. If you remember, up to this point, we always said fetch PDO : fetch associative. So we always had to explicitly define that we want to get the data as an associative array. So in this form essentially. But by using this as the standard fetch mode, we now can only say fetch like so, or fetch all, and this will always return our data as an associative array. So we can just leave this PDO fetch associative every time, and it's just a little bit cleaner and we do not have to think about it every single time. And right here you say that attribute emulate prepare should be equal to false. Without this option, PHP might emulate prepared statements, and instead of using real prepared statements, we're going to use emulated prepared statements. And you just have to remember that emulating prepared statements is not really safe. You always want to use real prepared statements. So we're going to say attribute emulate prepares is equal to false. And now we can pass those options as the fourth argument to this PDO object. And now we're good to go and we have a safe, secure connection. And this right here is best practice. Now it's also best practice to create a session instead of one single file. So I'm going to say session.inc.php. In this file, we will create a session, we will start the session, and we will configure the session. And if another file now wants to start a session, all it has to do, so let's say another file, now all this other file has to do is just load, so include this session file right here. And by loading the session file, it will obviously do the exact same. So it will also create, start, and configure the session. So we can load our session file. And if we have a lot of files now, all of those files just have to load this single session file and can create, start, and configure the session all at once just by loading this file within a single line of code. Let me show you. Again, we want to create PHP code right here. And to configure the session, we want to configure the cookie as well as the session data. Let's start by creating the default values for our cookie. Instead of the cookie, we're going to store our session data later on. So we say session _set cookie _params like so. And as you can see, we can, as an associative array again, pass our options for our cookie. The first one that you usually want to set is going to be the lifetime. The lifetime can be equal to 1800, which is equal to 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, we're going to delete the cookie. For the domain, we can just leave that one empty, which means just use the current domain. Path is going to be equal to a slash, which just means this cookie is available or valid on the entire page. Secure is going to be equal to false. If you want to use this in production, this here has to be true. But in our case, we're working on localhost, and localhost only runs on HTTP right here. HTTP only is going to be true. So we only want to transfer this cookie via HTTP, and same site is going to be legs. And if you would send this to production, this here would be true, and this here would be example.com, for example, so your domain. But in our case, since we're just testing on our local host on an HTTP page, so not HTTPS, we can remove that one, and secure has to be false in our case. But just remember, if you want to send this to production, always make sure that this is correct. Let's end the statement. So now we defined our cookie parameters, so the settings for our cookie. Now that we defined the values, we can start our session by using session_start. So now we started our session, but we also want to regenerate our session ID every 30 minutes, because otherwise an attacker could steal our session ID and therefore pretend being another user forever. So we're going to check if isSet is equal to false, so if our session variable that we can only access because we started the session right here of last regeneration, and this is just a preference, this name right here can be whatever you like, and we will define it one later on, but last regeneration is a convention. So if this session variable is not set, then we're going to execute a little bit of code, and otherwise we're going to execute some other code, like so. So if this variable is not set, then we have to set it, of course. So we set session of last regeneration is equal to something. What is this equal to? First of all, if this session of last regeneration variable is not set, so then we just created the session right now, and usually it's a pretty good practice to just regenerate the session ID right after your session has been started. To regenerate the session ID, we're going to use session _regenerate ID. We're going to pass true right here. This means delete the old session ID, replace it with a new session ID. Now that we regenerated the session ID, we should also save the time of regeneration somewhere. And for saving the time of regeneration, we're going to use the session variable right here. So we're going to set this equal to our time, like so. And now we know the time of our last regeneration. And as I said, after 30 minutes, we want to regenerate our session, again, our session ID. So this helps us to keep track of the time. Now I'm going to create an interval. That interval is going to be equal to the interval of my session regeneration. And in my case, I want to regenerate our session every 30 minutes. So I'm going to say 60 seconds times 30. So this defines 30 minutes. And now I'm going to take a look if our current time, so the time at this moment, minus our interval is going to be greater or equal to our session of last regeneration. So if that is the case, then I'm again going to use session regenerate ID. This is going to be equal to true. And I'm going to say session of last regeneration is equal to the current time again, like so. So what this line essentially just means, if at this point in time 30 minutes have passed, then I'm going to regenerate the session ID once again, and I'm going to set the point of our last regeneration to this point right now, because we just regenerated the session ID again, so the session last regeneration variable should be equal to the current time. And again, after 30 minutes, this code here will run again, will regenerate the session ID, and so on. So we will regenerate the session ID every 30 minutes. We also have the right cookie params, so this one should work. And now every time we want to use a database connection, so every time we have to write into the database, read from the database, and so on, we can just load this dbh.inc.php. And every time we need our session, for example, if we want to check the login status, we can just include this file right here. So now we're also going to use the MVC architecture for this register and login page. Let's start by creating the pages, and then I'll explain a little bit. So we're going to create our register _ const.inc.php. I'm also going to create a register _ model.inc.php. And I'm going to create a register _ view.inc.php. And now I'm also going to create a register.inc.php. So how this works is I write all of the code inside of the register.inc.php. So this is our base file. And then we have a model, we have a view, and we have a controller. Our model is the only one that is allowed to work with the database. The view is the only one that is allowed to render data, so to display data on the page. And the controller is responsible for controlling everything. So for the logic, so error handling, etc. So again, if you want to get data from the database, for example, who is responsible? In that case, the model is responsible because we want to work with the database. If you want to create a new user, who's responsible? The model is responsible because we are working with the database. Let's say we're having an error and we want to display this error to the user. Who's responsible for displaying the error to the user? The view is responsible for displaying the error to the user, because only the view is responsible for showing the user anything. So if you want to show an error, if you want to show a message, if you want to show information, all of that will be handled by the view. And now if you want to check for an error within your code, so if you want to see is there an error within the input field, who's responsible for that? For that logic, the controller is responsible, because the controller is responsible for all of the logic within your code. Again, this is going to be a basic PHP file. We do not need a closing tag because this will only include PHP. And once we're going to press on this submit button within the register page, so within this register form, then we want to execute this register.inc.php file. So we're going to say ./include/register.inc.php. So this file right here will be executed once we press on this register button. And to show you that that is actually the case, let me just echo out clicked right here, for example. So every time I click on this register button, we should see clicked somewhere here. So let me go to the register page. Let's click, and as you can see now, we are getting clicked right here. Obviously, this is not what we want, but you see that this seems to work. So let me just remove this code. In our case, we only want to do something if we get a post request from this page. So if someone clicks this button. So if server of request method is going to be equal to post, then what do we have to do in that case? First of all, we have to store all of the values from this form, so email, username, and password within variables. So let's go to the register.php and let's say our email is equal to, let's use trim for post, so for our post superglobal, and get our email value. For our username, we want to do the exact same. The only difference is that we want to get our username this time, like so. And now for our PVD, so our password, we just say post password. So why do we not trim the password? Maybe the user entered some white spaces, but this is not an accident. Those are just the spaces within the password. So we want to allow white spaces within the password, but white spaces in front or at the end of an email or a username is pretty useless, as you can imagine. Now inside of this file, we also need to require or create the connection to the database. So we need to include this file right here that creates our PDO connection, because we want to use this PDO connection in our register file, because obviously we need to write into our database. So we're going to say require once ./include/ and we are going to get our dbh.inc.php because that one is going to create our database connection. Now we also want to create our session because we need to access our session within this file. So we say require once ./include/ session inc.php. So now we created a connection to the database and we created our session. Now we also want to get our model and our controller. Why do we not need to get our view? The reason for this is that our view is only responsible for displaying data on the page. So we might want to use our view, or we might want to include our view on our index.php file, because right here we might want to display an error, for example. But this page is only responsible for creating the user in the database and maybe saving some errors or handling some errors, but it's not responsible for displaying the errors. So we will only require once ./include, and we're going to get our controller, and we're also going to get ./include/ our model right here. And usually you want to load the model right before the controller, like so. Because the controller might need the model later on, but if you load the model after the controller, then the controller cannot access the model. But the model will never need the controller. So model always before controller. Now we're going to need a try catch block afterwards, because we want to try something, and in case this does not work, we want to catch something. What are we going to catch? We're going to catch a PDO exception. The object is going to have the name e, for example, and in case we are getting an exception, we're just going to error underline log, for example, error like so, .e get message. And we're also going to exit. So we need this try catch block because we now want to start to write into the database, or do stuff with the database, because now we want to write into the database. And obviously there can occur an error, so we need to catch this error. And exit just says, just stop the script from execution at this point. And you will oftentimes also just see die, and this right here means the exact same. But I prefer exit personally. And a lot of people say that this is the convention in those cases and this is the convention in those cases. But in my opinion, since they really do the exact same thing, don't really think about it. Just do whatever you prefer. And since they do the exact same, you don't really have to care about the convention there, in my opinion. But now we also want to check for a couple of errors. So for example, the user could just enter an empty email field, an empty username field, and just press register right now. And this would be completely valid. So we should, for example, check if the email is empty, if the username is empty, or if the password is empty. And if one of those things is empty, then we might want to save an error message inside of the session variable and stop the script from execution. So we can, for example, check if is empty, like so. And if that is the case, then we want to do something. But we do not have this function right here yet. So this is a function. Obviously, we could create a function right here and say is empty. Then we can just define a body right here and so on. But as I mentioned, we created a model view controller architecture. And who is responsible for the logic? So who is responsible for checking for errors? And that is, of course, the controller, because the controller should make sure that the logic of our file is correct. So we're going to go, instead of our controller right here, we're going to say that this here is a PHP script, like so. Again, we only need the opening tag. And now we can define the function right here. So we can say function is empty, like so. And as you can see now, the error right here is gone because we included our controller right here and we are only calling it after we included the controller. So this is empty function is now available within this file. What should this function do and what should this function accept? This function should accept a couple of parameters, in our case our email, our username, and our PVD. And now our function needs to make sure that all of those values are empty. So we could, for example, do an if condition, if email, if empty email, or empty username, or empty PVD, like so. If that is the case, then we're going to return true because then it is empty. Else we're going to return false because then it is not empty. But as you can see, there's a lot of code. There's also a shorter way to write this. We can just return empty email or empty username or empty PVD. So if we have an empty email, we're going to return true, or if we have an empty username, we're going to return true, or if we have an empty PVD, we're going to return true. Because in those cases, is empty is going to be true because it is empty, obviously. So we need to pass those values, so those variables, as arguments to our function because it accepts our email, username, and PVD. So we say email, username, PVD. So now we checked whether this is empty. So if this is going to be true, so if this is going to be empty, we want to do something. What do we want to do? We want to save an error. We do not want to display an error yet because our view is responsible for displaying the error. We only want to save the error so we can access the error later on within the view. So again, we're going to create this function within the controller because our controller is responsible for the logic. So we say function, save error. And now we need to save the error within our controller somewhere where our view can access it later on. And as you probably know, our session is responsible for sharing data across different pages. So we should save this error within our session. It might make sense to accept the message right here as a parameter, so we can define custom messages for every single error. And now I'm going to say, instead of our session variable, I'll have the field register error, for example. You can define the name right here yourself, but register error is pretty descriptive, so I might make that. And this is going to be equal to our message right here. And if we get this error, then we might also want to exit the script from execution, because at this point we have an error. It might not really make too much sense to keep executing and writing into the database, because after checking for all of the errors, we want to write into the database. But obviously, if you have an error, we do not want to write into the database, so we just stop the script at this point. We save the error in the session variable, and later on the view can just display the error to the user, and he can try again if he wants to. So at this point, we can also define a message right here, so an error message that we want to display to the user later on. And this error message can be all fields required. And now right before we want to exit, we should also redirect the user. We want to redirect the user to the register page again. So we can just say header, location. Our register page is our index.php. So we say that we want to get the user to our ./index.php file. And right after we redirected the user and saved the error, instead of the session variable, we are going to exit the script. So let's reload the page. Let me try to execute that one. And as you can see, we're getting an undefined array key password. And for the password, I have a third S right here. So I'm going to remove that one. Let me again register. Now we're getting those errors right here. So we cannot use // but we have to use just the name of the file. So dbh.inc.php because we're in the same folder. So that should work like so, and like so. Let me save that one. Let's go back, reload the page. Let's register. And as you can see, nothing happened. And the reason that nothing happened is because all of our fields are empty. So we're just getting redirected to the initial page. And let me show you that that in fact works by going to our register controller.inc.php. And now I'm just going to redirect to our login.php if we get an error. So you will see that we will get redirected to a different page. And as you can see now, I will get redirected to the login page because that was the route that I defined right here. But in our case, I want to get redirected to the register page if we have an error on the register page, which makes sense because the user should be able to retry again. So now we save this error if we have an empty email, but now we might also want to check if the email is even valid, for example. So again, we're going to register inc.php. I'm going to check if valid email. I have to pass our email right there. And if we do not have a valid email, then I'm going to save an error, invalid email, for example. So now we can reuse the save error method over and over again. And I can also check if email in use. And now I can pass our PDO object and our email. And you will see why I'm going to do that one in a second. And if our email is in use, then I'm going to save an error again, email in use. So first of all, we need to check whether we have a valid email. If we do not have a valid email, so if we have an invalid email, for example, then I want to save an error. So let me create this function again instead of the controller. I'm going to check if we have an invalid email. We're going to accept our email as a parameter. And how can we now check whether our email is valid? We can do so by using filter underline var as a value. As the first argument, we need to define the value. Our value is going to be the email. And as the second argument, we need to define the filter function. In our case, we want to filter validate email. So we want to validate our email. If we have an invalid email, then we want to return true. So we're just going to return the result of filter var. But at the moment, this is going to be true if we have a valid email. But we only want to return true if we have an invalid email. So we just have to use the not operator. So we're going to return true if we do not have a valid email. So if we have an invalid email. So now this makes sense. If we have an invalid email, we're going to save this error. And now we want to check whether the email is in use. And in order to check that, we have to get data inside of our database. And a lot of people would first go into the controller, create a function right here, then create a function in the model that will only get the data and return the data to the controller. But in that case, I usually prefer to only use the model. And that's in the end preference. I'm not really using a super strict version of the MVC architecture, but I just want you to know if you want to follow the strictest version of MVC, you would first create a function right here instead of the controller. This controller would now call the model to get the data, then validate the data, and then return the value to your register inc.php file. But in my case, since I'm going to query the database, I will just go into the model. I will create a PHP opening tag right here. I create function email in use. I have to get the PDO object and I have to get the email. I'm going to create a query right here. The query says select email from users where email is equal to our email placeholder right here. And I'm going to limit this to 1. Because after I found one email, that obviously means that this email is already in use. There's no reason to keep executing or to keep querying the database at this point. So at this point, I'm just going to stop the query. Now I'm going to prepare a statement. That one is equal to PDO. I'm going to prepare the statement. So I'm going to prepare the query to be precise, like so. Now I have to bind the value. So I'm going to say statement bind value. to our email placeholder, I want to bind our email value like so. Now I'm just going to say statement, fetch, and right here I can use fetch column, for example, like so. And I'm also going to show you a trick. If you want to get auto completion for all of those methods, you can also say that this here is going to be a PDO object. So an object of type PDO. I'm going to do that fetch column, for example. And as you can see, now I get auto completion because now PHP knows that this is going to be a PDO object. So I can use this like a normal PDO object and I get auto completion. So I want to fetch a column. And the point of this one is if I do not have this email in the database, this is going to return false. If I have a column, so if I have a user in the database that has an email or that has this email already, then this is going to return the user, or in our case, the email. But obviously I do not really want the email. I want this to be true if the email is in use, and I want this to be false if the email is not in use. So if fetch column returns something, so if a user exists, then I want to turn this into a Boolean. And I can do so by using bool, so type conversion of this statement in the end. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to accept that one, and then I'm going to return bool statement like so. And obviously before fetching, we also need to execute the statement. So execute like so. So now we are defining the query, we are preparing the query, we are binding the value to our placeholder, we are executing the query, and then we are fetching the column, so the value. So if we get a column, our email is going to be in use. And it's as simple as that. So now if we have an error, I would also like to display this error to the user. And in order to display things, we can use our view. So let's go to the view. Let's create a basic PHP file. We create a function that can have the name display error, and this one is just going to echo out an error if we have an error. So I'm going to say echo. This is going to be a paragraph. We're going to concatenate that one, and we're going to concatenate that one as well because we also want to have a closing tag for our paragraph right here. And in between those tags, in between this paragraph essentially, I want to display whatever we have in our session variable. So I'm going to access session, and if you remember, we stored within our register controller, the register error within our session register error variable. So within this variable, we should have an error if we have an error. So this one should be set if we have an error, and otherwise this is not going to be set. So I'm just going to replace that one with our error. So we're just going to do this if we have an error. But if we do not have an error, we should obviously not execute this one. So we're going to say if is set, if our session register error variable is set. But in our case, if that one is not set, so if we do not have an error, then we just want to return essentially. Then we do not want to execute this code. If we do execute this code though, we are displaying the error to the user, and afterwards we want to give the user the option to try again. Obviously, if the user wants to try again, we should also clear the errors after displaying the errors. So we should unset this session variable. And by using unset name of the session variable, we're essentially just going to delete this variable. And this needs to be an argument of this function. So now the logic of this is we're checking if we do not have a register error. If we do not have a register error, just return, because then we do not have an error and the user can proceed. If we do have an error though, then we're going to show or display the error to the user. And afterwards, we're going to clear this error so the user can try again in the next round. If the user in the next round again has an error, this variable will of course be set once again, but otherwise he should obviously be able to proceed without the session variable right here. So let's use this display error instead of our index.php because that is the place where we want to display this error. And to be precise, we want to display our error maybe right below this login section. So we can just say that this is going to be PHP code like so. We want to call our display error function from our view like so. And if we want to display our error, we also need access to our session because right here, instead of our view, we are accessing this session. So we need the session instead of our index.php as well. So I'm going to use an opening and closing PHP tag right here. And again, I'm going to use require once, and I'm going to require include / session inc.php. So right here, we are starting the session. Now the session is available and our display error function instead of our view can access this session variable that we have set within our controller right before. So now let me reload the page. We're getting uncaught error call to undefined function. The reason for this is that we never incorporated our view right here. So right below, we also need to say require once include And now we also need to include our view file because this function comes from our view file. Let's reload the page. As you can see, we're not having an error. Let me register. And we're getting this error. And the reason for this is that, let's go to our register controller again, that I'm right here redirecting to a register page. But obviously this is going to be our index page, not our register page. So again, let me reload this project because we do not have this register.php. Like so. So let's again test our logic. Let's first of all click register, and as you can see, all fields are required. So let me also enter an invalid email. Let's press register. We are again getting all fields are required. And let's enter everything but have an invalid email. Invalid email, as you can see. Now we get this error message. And testing email in use is probably something that we cannot test yet. But as you can see, now we know that our error handler worked. And you can also make this error handler look a little bit better if you wanted to. And I'm going to show you how really quickly by just saying that this here has the class, for example, equal to, let's just use those quotation marks, error, for example. So now we have this error class, and we can just use normal CSS to style this error right here by saying background is, for example, equal to red, and the color is maybe also equal to red. Let's just say that, and I'm going to use a pretty dark red and a slightly brighter red right here. Let me reload the page. Let's get an error. All fields are required. And from time to time, you also might experience that your CSS is not reloading. And in that case, you can press Ctrl F5 because this is going to clear your cache. And from time to time, you might not see your CSS if you're programming within PHP. And I don't know if you will get this bug, but if you get this bug, just press Ctrl F5 and clear your cache, because sometimes your cache will prevent your CSS from updating to the current version. But as you can see, now we have those styles. But again, this is not a CSS tutorial, so I'm just going to delete those styles and refresh. So now this is how it looks. So we're getting the error message, but now let's also create the user in the database. And now let's again go to our register inc.php. So at this point, we checked for errors. So at this point, it might make sense to create a user. So I'm going to create a new function, create user, instead of my model, because I want to create a new user. And I will just call this function right here instead of register inc.php. This function will need a PDO. It will need our email. It will need our username, and it will need our PVD, so our password. Let's create this function instead of our model. So we go right here and say function, create user. Again, this will get the PDO object, the email, the username, and the PVD, like so. And now I have to create a query. So I'm going to create the query, insert into users. What kind of values do we want to insert into our users database, or into our table to be precise? Our email, our username, and our PVD. Why is that the case? Because those are the column names that we define inside of our users table right here. So email, username, PVD. ID and created at will again be set by default. What kind of values do I want to insert? Let me go to a new line so you see it a little bit better. So values, I want to have a placeholder for our email, a placeholder for our username, and a placeholder for our PVD, like so. Let's end the statement. And now we need to prepare the statement. So we say statement is equal to PDO. We're going to prepare our query right here. And now we need to bind our values. So I'm going to say statement bind value to our email placeholder. I'm going to bind our email value that we get right here to our username. So colon username. I'm going to bind our username variable, like so. And to our password, I'm going to bind the value. So to the password placeholder, I'm going to bind our password variable, so the value. Now I'm just going to use statement, and I'm going to execute the statement. And let's just test whether this works. So let's use a valid email, let's use a valid username, let's use a password, and let's press register. And we're getting email in use. So we seem to have a problem right there. What is the problem? Let's take a look at our register.inc.php. And right here, this was my mistake. Obviously, we need to store this value somewhere. So we need to store this value in a result, for example, and then we can just turn this result into a Boolean, because statement will obviously not hold the return value. And now let's just try this again. So yapo@gmail, random username, random password. Let's press register. And as you can see, we're getting redirected. Obviously, we have to fix that in a second, but let's first of all take a look at our users table and see whether we have a user right now. And as you can see, now we have this user right here that we just created. There's also a problem with this user because we are storing the password as plain text, and this does not really make sense. So let me show you how to fix that. In order to do so, we need to hash our password. So we can create right here a hashed password that's going to be equal to password underline hash. We have to pass our password as the first argument, so PVD. And for the second argument, we need to define the algorithm we want to use. And usually you want to use bcrypt. So we're going to use password underline default or bcrypt. And in our case, let's just use bcrypt to show you that this works. Again, let's save that one. Let's go to our page once again. We're going to go back. We're having a random email. Now let's also test whether this works. So Yahoo was our previous email. So now we should get email already in use. Register, email already in use. You can see this works. Let's use this email, register, and as you can see, this seems to work. Let's reload our page, and now we have our second user right here, but password is still plain text, and the reason is obviously for that we need to pass our hash password instead of our normal password when binding the value. So now let's just try this again really quick. We are going to go to our project. Let's use a random email, random password, random username, doesn't matter. Let's reload the page, and as you can see now we're having the hash password right here. Now that we created this user, it might also make sense to get the user ID. So we're going to return something right here. We are going to return PDO, and we can get last insert ID. So we get the ID of the user that has been inserted into the database by using last insert ID. And what can we do with the user ID now? Let me show you. We can now store this user ID instead of a variable. So user ID is equal to create user because we're returning this user ID right here. And now we can save this user ID inside of our session, and we can later on use this user ID to verify whether the user is logged in or not. So we can say session of user underline ID, this name is up to you again, is equal to our user ID variable. And now let's just say we are going to create a home page. So home.php, for example. This is just normal HTML, and this is going to be our home page. And once we are registered, let's say we want to redirect the user to this home page. So we can now use header location home.php. So once everything worked, we do not have an error. At this point, we're going to redirect to the home page. And after that, we're just going to exit because we want to stop the script from executing at this point. So let's test this code right here. Let's go back to our index.php. Let's register with a new user. We're clicking register, and the requested URL was not found on the server. And the reason for this is that we obviously need to say .. because we're inside of our register.inc.php. So we need to go one level up to our home.php file. So again, that was my error. So let's do that one again. Different email, register. And as you can see, we're landing on the home page. Let's also inspect the page. Let's go to application. And as you can see, we have this cookie right here that stores our PHP session ID. So the ID for our session. And now it's also best practice to regenerate the session ID right after we registered and right after we logged in. So usually you do something like this, session, regenerate ID, and it's going to be equal to true at this point. So once we log in, we regenerate the ID, and let me show you how this looks. We're going here, we're going to register with a random email, random password, random username, and we're having a new session ID right here. And this right here is just best practice. I really highly recommend you to do this. So let me show you why we created this session variable. So if we are on our home page now, for example, I can just go to the top. I can say I want to create PHP code right here. I'm just going to require once our include folder. So include like so. And now I'm just going to require our session. So I'm going to start a session. So I have access to our session. And now I can check if session of user ID set. So if we have a user ID, only if we have a user ID, we know that we have a registered user and that our user is ideally also logged in, because when you log out, you want to destroy the session variable, obviously. And only if that is going to be the case, only then we are going to stay on this page. If that is not the case, so if this variable is not set like so, then we are going to use our header to redirect the user to location index.php, so to our register page in this case. It could also be the login page, doesn't really matter. So if I'm going to reload, right now we have our cookie. So we have this cookie that stores the session ID, that proves that we have a user who is currently logged in. But if I'm going to delete this cookie and I'm going to reload, you can see that we are getting redirected to our index page. So again, if I'm going to log in like so, email is already in use. I don't know, that's crazy. So let's use that one and a password. Let's register. We're getting redirected to the home page. Let me clear the cookie. And now if I want to do something on this page, I'm getting redirected to the register page. So as you can see, by using this code, you can create protected routes. You're just going to check whether the session variable user ID is set. If it is set, then you know the user is logged in at this point. Otherwise, the user is not logged in and you should redirect him to the register page. And that is how an app like Instagram would do it, for example. Now let's also create the login for our page, and I'm going to go through it a little bit faster because I think we saw everything and it's pretty similar, to be honest. So we have this login page. Obviously, we need to create a login.inc.php file again, a login underline const.inc.php file, so a controller, a login underline model.inc.php, and a login underline view.inc.php. And I'm not going to copy paste everything. I want to type it out once again so you really see how this is working, but I'm going to go through it a little bit faster. Right here, we start with an opening tag. We're going to check if our server request method is equal to post. If that is the case, then we need to get our email. So we need to store our email inside of this variable. So we're going to trim what we get from our post superglobal of email. And for the PVD, we are going to get our post password value right here. We're again going to require once dbh.inc.php because we need that one. So we need a database connection. Require underline once session.inc.php. And now we also need to get our model. So require once login underline model.inc.php. I don't know why I'm not getting auto completion, but I hope I wrote everything correct. So require once login underline const.inc.php. So now we have all of the files. Now we need a try catch block again. In case we're getting an error, we're getting a PDO exception object that we can name E. If we get this error, we're going to use error underline log, and I'm just going to say error colon space, and I'm going to concatenate that error with our error message that I get by using get message like so. And I'm just going to exit the program. So we'll stop the code from execution. At this point, if everything worked, we can check for one error. So I'm going to keep this super simple. I'm just going to say if is empty, for example, email or PVD. Then I'm just going to save error and I'm going to say all inputs required, for example. I don't have those functions yet, so I need to create those ones instead of the controller. So I'm going to go into our login controller. This is again a PHP file. Function is empty. We'll accept our email and our PVD, and we're going to return empty of email or empty of PVD. So if our email or our password is empty, then we're going to return true. So then it's going to be empty. And let's also create the save error function. So save error. This will accept the message. If we have an error, then we're going to say that our session variable of login underline error is going to be equal to message. We're going to redirect our user to our /login.php, so to our login page essentially. And we're going to exit the code from execution at this point. So now we basically saved our error in the session variable. So let's also display that error by using our view. This is again a PHP file. So PHP function display error. We are going to say if is set session of login underline error. And if this variable is not set, then we do not have an error. In that case, we do not want to display an error, so we're just going to return. If we do have this error though, then we're going to echo out a paragraph. We're going to concatenate that paragraph with the session variable right here. So we display whatever we stored inside of this variable. And this here should be error as far as I know. And then we're just going to close the paragraph like so. And afterwards, we're just going to unset our session of login error, like so. Now let me also use that one on a login page. So I'm going to go right here, PHP code, opening and closing tags. I'm going to require once. What am I going to require? I'm going to require include / I want to get our login view, but right before I get the view, I also need to get the session because I need access to the session within this login view because I'm accessing the session within this login view. So require once include / session inc.php. So now right here, I can also say that I want to use PHP code once again, like so, and I'm going to display our error. Let me save that one. Let's take a look at the page. I'm going to log in, register, and as you can see, we're getting redirected to the page. But at this point, nothing really happened because we do not have this action attribute. So for the action attribute, I need to say that I want to execute include / register inc.php. So let me register. Register is probably wrong. Actually, this text also needs to be login. That's my bad. So let's go to our login page. This here needs to be login. No, actually, this here needs to be register. My bad. And this needs to be login. Hopefully, this is correct now. So now we have login and register. So let's log in. And as you can see, we're getting redirected to the register page. So something seems to be off. And right here, I included our register page, but this obviously needs to be login.inc.php because that should be the file that we want to execute. So let's go to login, like so, and we are getting this error, all inputs are required. So now this seems to work as well. So I'm going to keep this to a minimum since you probably know how this works. Obviously for a real app, you want to do a lot of checks, but that's up to you. But now if we do not get an error, then we want to log the user in. So first of all, we need to check whether this user even exists. So we can create a function that has the name getUser, for example. And this one obviously needs a PDO object, so our PDO connection, email, and PVD, like so. And now we need to create this function. And this function needs to access the database. So I'm going to do this within the model. Again, this is going to be PHP code. I'm going to create a function, getUser, that gets a PDO object of type PDO, an email, and a PVD. Now I'm going to write a query. I'm going to say I want to select everything from users where email is equal to :email. So I'm going to find the user by using his email. I'm going to end the statement. And I'm also going to limit this to 1 because obviously we should only have one user with one email. So querying afterwards is pretty useless. Now I'm going to create a statement that is going to be equal to PDO. I'm going to prepare the statement. So I'm going to prepare our query right here. Now I'm going to say statement bind value to our email placeholder. I want to bind our email value right here. Actually, I do not even need the password, to be honest. So I'm just going to delete that one. And I'm just going to delete that one right here as well, like so. Now after I bound the value, I'm going to say statement execute. I'm going to execute the statement. And now I can also fetch the user. So I'm going to say that the result is equal to statement fetch. I will get one user as a result. And now I'm just going to return the result. So now I'm going to return the user in case I have a user, and otherwise this is just going to return false. So we're getting the user right here. So the user is equal to getUser. If we do not have a user, so if we did not find a user, then we can just save error user not found, like so. And obviously this here needs to be a not. So if we do not have a user, then we're going to save this as an error. If we do have a user though, we need to check for the password. So we can create a function check password that will get our original password, and it will also get our hash password. So what is our hash password? Our hash password is user of PVD, because that is the password that we have inside of our database. So the hash password, and that's going to be the password that the user entered right here when he tries to log in. And I'll show you how this one works in a second. So we need to create this function within our controller because we do not need to access the database this time. We just need to compare. So controller function check password. I'm going to accept the password, so the password the user entered, and the hash password that I'm getting from the database. And now I'm going to use password underline verify. That one takes two arguments again, the PVD and as a second argument, the hash password. So hash password in our case. Now it's going to compare, or it's going to verify the password if the hash that this method generated from the entered password is equal to the hash that is stored within the database, then this is going to return true, otherwise it's going to return false. So I'm just going to return this one, and right now we're checking if this is a valid password. So let's just rename the function and say invalid password. So if this is not valid, then we want to return true because then it's an invalid password. And now we also need to rename the function right here. And if we get an invalid password, so if invalid password, then we want to save an error that says invalid password. And usually it's best practice to not tell the user whether it was an invalid password or an invalid email, because that would give potential attackers the opportunity to guess whether the password or the email was invalid. And if he knows that the email exists, then it's a lot easier to guess the password, for example. Otherwise, he would have to guess email and password without even knowing whether the email exists or not. So you could just say wrong and wrong right here. Obviously, usually you want to use a more descriptive name, but it should be the exact same name for invalid email and invalid password to not give potential attackers any information. So this here seems to work. Now, if the password was valid and the email was valid, then we want to log the user in. So we can say session of user underline ID is going to be equal to our user of PVD. Not of PVD, that would be the worst thing you could probably do, so of ID. And obviously you can also store other things like your email right here if you wanted to, by saying it's equal to user of email. But in our case, I do not really need this, so I'm just going to leave this away. I might also want to regenerate the session ID, because again, you should always regenerate the session ID if you log in or register. Then I want to redirect the user, maybe to our home page as well, so /home.php, and I want to exit. So at this point, I want to stop the code from executing. So now let's test this again. Let me create a valid email. So easy@gmail.com. Username is easy. Password is going to be easy. I'm going to register, getting redirected to the home page. Let's take a look at our database. Now we have easy@gmail.com. Let me reload the page. Let's go to our index.php. Let me also clear the cookie. So application, cookie, and I'm just going to clear that one. I'm going to reload the page. I'm going to log in. I'm going to use easy@gmail.com and easy as a password. Let me log in. And we're getting this error because undefined function invalid password. Okay, and I defined this function within the register controller, which is obviously wrong. So I need to get that one to the login. So let's save that one. I need to get that one to the login controller. Where is it? Login controller. I'm going to save that one right here. Let me retry. Let's go back. Let's say easy is the password. We're logging in. And as you can see, we're getting redirected to the home page. So now we're logged in. Let's also do something else. So let's say if we're on the login page, so right here, we are already having our session and our view. So now we can use our session. So session of user ID to check whether the user is already logged in. And if the user is already logged in, it might not really make sense to give the user the opportunity to access our login and register page. So we are checking if is set session of user ID. If the session variable is set, so if we have a user ID, so the user is in fact logged in, then we're going to use our header location home.php. So we redirect the user to our home page. And let's do the exact same for our register page as well, so our index.php, like so. Let me now reload the page. We should be logged in. Let's go to our index.php, and as you can see, we are getting redirected to our home page if I go to login.php or our index.php, because we are now logged in, and in fact, the user should not be able to access this page. Now I'm going to clear the cookie. I should be able to get to our index.php, as you can see I am, and to our login page as well. And now if I'm going to use easy@gmail.com and easy to log in, I am logged in. And now again, I cannot get to our login.php page. So now let me also show you how to log out, because that is probably the last thing you want to do. And that's also pretty easy. So let me just close all of this and let's just create a logout.inc.php like so. I'm going to create basic PHP code. I'm going to check if server request method is equal to post. If that is the case, then I want to do something. In our case, the first thing I want to do is I want to take this session right here and set this equal to an empty array. So I'm just going to clear all of the session variables first of all. Now I'm also going to get the cookie params by using params is equal to session underline get cookie params like so. So I'm getting all of the parameters and you will see why in a second. Now I'm going to set the cookie and now you can define a name for the cookie. And in our case, I'm just going to use session underline name like so. So this will return the name of the current session. So we'll just use the exact same name again. For the value, I'll keep this an empty string. And now we need to define the expiration date of this cookie. And what do we want to do right here? Since we want to log out, we want to delete our cookie, our current cookie that has all of the information that our user is logged in. But our user is not logged in anymore. So we need to delete this cookie. How can we delete this cookie? That's pretty easy. We're just setting this expiration date to the past, because that means the cookie is now expired and does not work anymore and is therefore deleted. So I'm going to say time minus 3600. Why that value? Actually, that's just a convention, and you can also do minus 10, for example, minus 1, doesn't really matter. Now you can see that we also need to define the path, the domain, the secure value, HTTP only. And we can get all of those values by just using the exact same values that we've defined for our initial cookie by using the params right here. And those are just the values that we defined right here. So those were the old values that we had, and we do not want to change those values usually. So we can just use the exact same values, and instead of typing them all out again and again, we're just going to say we want to get params of path, for example. Next up, we want to get params of domain. Then we want to get params of secure, like so. And then we want to get params of HTTP only, like so. Let's end the statement. So now this should work. This should just reset the cookie, and let me just format this a little bit. So now this is what this looks like. And now in the end, we also want to destroy the session. So session underline destroy, for example, like so. Then we are going to redirect the user maybe to our register page, because now he has to either register or log in again. So we're going to say go to ./index.php, which is our register page, and afterwards you can exit. So we are going to stop the code from executing. And this here is going to log the user out, and it's as simple as that. So now we also need to execute this file on a button click, for example. So let's do that. Let's go to our home.php. We're going to add a form of post that is going to execute include /logout log, so /logout inc.php. This one will only have a button that is going to submit the form and has the name logout, for example. Let me reload the page. Now we have this logout button. Let me press logout. We're getting redirected to the register page. We want to get to our home page now, home.php. This does not work. We're getting redirected to the register page. Let's log in, easy@gmail.com. Password is easy. Let's log in. We are right here again. Logging out. We are right here again. So this mechanism seems to work. And also, remember, since we are deleting the session right here instead of our logout.inc.php, so as you can see, we're destroying our session. You might wonder, do we even have a session at this point? And we have a session. The session just does not hold the user data anymore because we are immediately regenerating the session instead of our session inc.php if we need it, once our session variable is not set anymore. And if you take a look at this, once we destroy the session and set this session to an empty array, our session variable is not set anymore, and therefore we are regenerating a session ID. But this is a fresh session that has absolutely no data at this point. So no user ID, nothing at all, just a plain session ID. And once the user decides to log in again, then we are going to set our user underline ID variable again. Therefore, we know the user's logged in again, and we slowly can start to populate our session with values that we need. And that is how this entire process works. I really hope you learned a lot doing this project. I know this is a little bit confusing in the beginning, but I'm definitely sure that you get the hang of it once you practice this a little bit. And you can always come back to this tutorial if you need to understand it once again.